Imagine a king so terrified of his own mortality that he refused to sleep for decades. A man who believed that closing his eyes, even for a moment, would cause the sun itself to disappear forever. This is the true story of Louis XIV, the most powerful monarch in history, who slowly descended into madness while the world watched in golden silence. They called him the Sun King, but what they didn't know was that he had become afraid of the dark inside his own mind. Every night, while his courtiers slumbered in their silk-draped chambers, Louis wandered the endless corridors of Versailles, like a ghost haunting his own palace, convinced that sleep was the enemy of kings, that rest was rebellion against divine will. By the end of his reign, servants would find him at dawn, still in his ceremonial robes from the day before, his eyes bloodshot and wild, talking to mirrors as if they held the secrets of eternity. The most magnificent court in Europe had become a theater of insomnia, where the leading actor had forgotten the difference between performance and reality. But here's what they never told you. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about power, madness, and the price of believing yourself to be a god among mortals. Close your eyes and let the weight of centuries settle around you like velvet curtains. We are drifting backward through time, past the noise of our modern world, past the echoes of revolution and war, until we arrive at a place where gold catches eternal light and shadows dance in endless corridors. Here, in the heart of 17th century France, stands a palace that defies the very concept of night. But before we enter those gilded halls, you must understand something crucial. Versailles was never meant to be just a palace. It was designed as a machine, a carefully engineered instrument of control that would transform the wildest nobles of France into docile courtiers. What Louis XIV didn't realize was that in creating this machine, he would become its most tragic victim. Versailles rises from the earth like a fevered dream made manifest in marble and crystal. The morning mist clings to its endless gardens, where fountains whisper secrets to statues of forgotten gods. Inside, 10,000 mirrors reflect not just light, but the weight of absolute power concentrated in the hands of one man. The air itself seems to shimmer with expectation, perfumed with jasmine and ambition, heavy with the breath of 1,000 courtiers who have learned to exist in perpetual daylight. Listen carefully, and you can almost hear it. The soft rustle of silk against marble floors, the distant echo of chamber music floating through gilded halls. But beneath these sounds lies something else. The restless footsteps of a king who has forgotten how to surrender to sleep, who believes that to close his eyes would be to let the sun itself fall from the sky. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. Versailles houses 40,000 servants, consumes enough wood daily to heat an entire village, and burns through candles at a rate that would bankrupt lesser kingdoms. But these statistics pale beside the human cost of maintaining this illusion of perpetual magnificence. Every courtier who enters these halls must surrender something precious, their freedom, their privacy, their very sense of self. And at the center of this golden web sits Louis, spinning faster and faster, driven by a compulsion that even he cannot name. The servants whisper that he has not slept a full night's sleep since his coronation. They say his physicians have begged him to rest, that his confessor has warned him that even God rested on the seventh day. But Louis has moved beyond such mortal concerns. He has convinced himself that he is something more than human, and therein lies the seed of his destruction. As you walk through these corridors for the first time, notice how the very architecture seems to pulse with nervous energy. Every surface gleams. Every shadow has been carefully calculated. Every sound has been orchestrated to create the impression of a world where perfection is not just possible, but inevitable. Yet something feels wrong, doesn't it? Something that your instincts recognize, even if your mind cannot quite grasp it. You're sensing what the courtiers learn to live with every day. The electric tension of a mind under enormous pressure, the crackling energy of a man who has pushed himself far beyond normal human limits. The palace beautiful and terrible, magnificent and menacing. It is a place where dreams come true and sanity goes to die. In this palace of impossible splendor, time moves differently. The Sun King has decreed that his court shall revolve around him like planets around their star, and so the day begins not with dawn, but with his awakening. though awakening is perhaps the wrong word for one who never truly sleeps. But here's the secret they don't want you to know. Every single ritual at Versailles, every ceremony, every moment pageantry serves a dual purpose. On the surface, it celebrates the king's magnificence. But underneath, it's all surveillance, a massive system of watching and being watched that would make modern intelligence agencies weep with envy. Picture the grand lever, the sacred ritual of the royal rising. Dozens of nobles crowd into the king's bedchamber, their faces masked with studied reverence as they witness Louis emerge from his restless half-slumber. His eyes are glass-bright, touched with the fervor of a man who sees divinity reflected in every mirror. The morning light streams through crystal windows, but it pales beside the radiance he believes emanates from his very skin. Watch carefully as he moves through his morning rituals. Each gesture choreographed, each moment a performance. His courtiers dress him like priests adorning a statue, their hands trembling not from cold, but from the electric tension that surrounds this man who claims the sun as a symbol. The fabrics are rich beyond imagination. Cloth of gold that seems to breathe, diamonds that capture and hold light like tiny prisons for fallen stars. But observe what's really happening here. Count the eyes watching his every movement. Notice how each noble fights for the privilege of handing him his shirt, of offering him his morning chocolate, of simply standing close enough to breathe the same air. This isn't worship. This is a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation disguised as ceremony. The palace awakens around him in waves. In the kitchens, hundreds of servants prepare feasts that could feed entire cities. In the gardens, groundskeepers tend to hedges sculpted into impossible geometries, creating a landscape that exists nowhere in nature. Every fountain, every painting, every carefully placed candlestick exists to reflect his glory back to him, an endless hall of mirrors where Louis can see himself multiplied into infinity. But here's what's truly chilling. Every single person in this vast palace exists primarily to observe and report. The maids who clean his chambers take note of how many times he rose during the night. The guards who patrol his corridors count his footsteps during his midnight wanderings. The courtiers who attend his morning rituals study his face for signs of weakness, for cracks in the divine facade. And Louis knows this. He has created a system where everyone watches everyone else, where privacy has been abolished in favor of perfect transparency. But in doing so, he has trapped himself in a glass cage where his every moment must be performed, where showing any sign of human frailty could bring down the entire elaborate structure he has built. The madness isn't just in his sleeplessness. It's an impossible burden of being constantly observed by thousands of eyes, all looking for signs that the God King might, after all, be merely human. Notice how his laughter rings just a note too high, how his gaze lingers a moment too long on shadows that shouldn't exist in such brilliant light. The courtiers smile, but their eyes dart toward the corners of rooms, seeking escape routes from a presence that grows more intense with each passing hour. The Duchess of Orleans, his sister-in-law, writes in her secret letters that the king has begun to speak to his own reflection during these morning ceremonies, conducting conversations with mirror images as if they were foreign ambassadors. She notes that his physicians have started adding sleeping drafts to his morning chocolate, but that Louis has developed an almost supernatural ability to resist their effects. What the courtiers don't realize yet, what we will discover as our story unfolds, is that Louis has begun to see enemies everywhere precisely because his system of total surveillance has started to work too well. When everyone is watching everyone else, paranoia becomes not madness but logic. And when a king cannot trust anyone in his court, sleep becomes not rest but surrender to potential assassination. The trap is closing around him, but Louis believes he is the hunter, not the prey. How wrong he is about to discover he has been. As evening falls, though darkness is always held at bay within these walls, whispers begin to circulate through the corridors like smoke. They speak of the king's strange habits, his nocturnal wanderings through halls that should be empty, his obsession with being seen and admired at every moment of every day. But tonight, something is different. Tonight, we will follow Louis deeper into his palace of mirrors than any historian has dared to go. Tonight, we will witness the moment when the Sun King first spoke aloud to fear, that will consume the rest of his life. It begins, as these things often do, with a sound that shouldn't exist. A whisper in an empty corridor. A footstep in a room that should be vacant. Louis, making his usual midnight rounds through the gallery of mirrors, stops suddenly in the center of the vast space. The moonlight streaming through the windows created a silver path across the marble floor, and for a moment, just a moment, he looks almost human. Who walks behind the king when the king cannot sleep? He asks his reflection, and his voice echoes strangely in the empty space. Who watches the watcher? Who guards the guardian? This is the first recorded instance of what palace physicians will later call the midnight confessions, moments when Louis, believing himself alone, would speak his deepest fears aloud to the only companion he felt he could trust, his own reflection. Tonight, like every night, Louis will not retire to his chambers in any conventional sense. Instead, he will prowl the palace like a restless spirit, checking on his courtiers, ensuring that his presence continues to cast its spell even in the small hours when ordinary mortals surrender to dreams. Sleep, he has declared, is for those who lack the divine spark. The sun does not rest, and neither shall its earthly embodiment. But follow him now as he glides to the gallery of mirrors at midnight, his footsteps echoing in spaces designed to amplify his magnificence. The mirrors reflect him endlessly, creating an army of golden figures stretching into infinity. But look closer. This is where the true horror begins, and you might notice that each reflection seems slightly different. One with eyes too bright, another with a smile too sharp, each one a fragment of mind beginning to fracture under the weight of its own grandiosity. I have built paradise, he tells his reflections, but paradise is a prison for gods who remember they were once men. The courtiers who encounter him in these midnight wanderings speak in hushed tones of his conversations with invisible advisors, his insistence that the Austrian court is plotting against him even as they sleep, his belief that every moment he does not spend in active rule is a moment stolen by his enemies. He has transformed vigilance into virtue, insomnia into a form of patriotic duty. But what they don't know, what we're about to discover, is that Louis has begun to receive reports from his vast network of spies that confirm his worst fears. Letters intercepted at the Spanish border speak of a plot to poison him during his sleep. Documents discovered in the Austrian embassy detail plans to infiltrate Versailles through the servant quarters. Intelligence reports from England describe a conspiracy to replace him with a more compliant puppet king. The tragedy is that some of these reports are real. In his paranoia, Louis has created such an efficient intelligence network that he has actually uncovered genuine threats against his life. But his sleepless mind can no longer distinguish between legitimate intelligence and the fevered imaginings of exhausted spies trying to please their insomniac master. In the shadows between the golden light, servants and guards exchange worried glances. They have begun to notice the tremor in his hands, the way his voice rises unexpectedly during conversations about trivial matters. The poison of absolute power, they whisper, is beginning to work as alchemy on the man who believed himself immune to mortal frailties. Dr. Antoine Daquin, the royal physician, maintained secret records of the king's condition. His notes, hidden in the palace archives, reveal a man caught between genuine threats and imaginary terrors. His Majesty speaks of poison in every meal, of assassins in every shadow, Daquin writes. Yet, yesterday we discovered arsenic in his morning wine, placed there by a servant in Austrian pay. When reality and madness produce the same results, how can any physician offer treatment? But the most chilling discovery comes from the Marquise de Maintenon, the king's secret wife, who begins to keep a diary of his midnight confessions. In these pages, we discover that Louis has started to believe that sleep itself has become his enemy, not just because he fears assassination, but because his dreams have begun to show him prophecies of France's future. I see fire in my dreams, he tells her one terrible night. I see palaces burning, heads on spikes, the monarchy itself consumed by flame. If I sleep, these visions become real. If I remain awake, I can hold back the tide of history itself. The question that will haunt the rest of his reign, the question that drives him deeper into madness with each passing night, is this: Are his prophetic dreams a product of a mind unraveling under pressure? Or has his refusal to sleep somehow given him access to a terrible knowledge that no king was meant to possess? As dawn approaches, and we prepare to leave him for now, remember this moment. Remember a king standing alone in a hall of mirrors, speaking to reflections that seem to whisper back, believing that his sleepless vigil is all that stands between France and utter destruction, whether he is a madman or a prophet, whether his fears are delusions or revelations. These questions will determine not just the fate of one man, but the destiny of an entire nation. Years flow like water through fountains of Versailles, and the king's radiance begins to take on a different quality. Still brilliant, but with the harsh glare of a flame consuming its own wick. The mirrors that once reflected only glory now show the subtle signs of a mind at war with itself. His face, once the very image of divine authority, bears the marks of a man who has stared too long into the abyss of his own mythology. But now we must speak of secrets that have remained buried for 3 centuries. In the deepest archives of Versailles, hidden behind false walls and forgotten locks, lie documents that tell a different story about Louis XIV's final decades. These papers, discovered only recently by researchers, reveal that the Sun King's madness may have been more method than anyone dared imagine. The court, that elaborate theater he has created, continues its endless performance, but the actors are growing weary. They have learned to navigate the increasingly erratic currents of his moods, to smile when his laughter turns wild, to nod agreement when his pronouncements drift into territory that maps the landscape of madness rather than statecraft. The golden cage he has built for them has become a prison for himself as well. But here's what the history books never told you. Louis was right about almost everything. The decoded intelligence reports from this period, finally released from government archives in 1998, reveal an astonishing truth. Every major threat that Louis imagined in his sleepless paranoia, the Austrian conspiracy, the English plot, the Spanish poison rings, the revolutionary underground that would one day consume his great-grandson, all of them were real. His network of spies, operated by exhausted agents reporting to an insomniac king, had actually uncovered the earliest threads of conspiracies that would eventually unravel the French monarchy. Watch as he stands before the great windows of his palace, gazing out at gardens that stretch to the horizon. In his eyes, you can see the reflection of a man who has achieved everything he ever desired and discovered that it weighs more than a human soul was meant to bear. The sun he claimed as a symbol sets each evening despite his will, a daily reminder that even gods are subject to forces beyond their control. I have seen the future, he tells a confessor, Father Lachaise, in a conversation recorded in the priest's private journal. I have seen palaces burning. I have seen my descendants led to scaffolds. I have seen the very idea of kingship perish in blood and fire. Every night I do not sleep is another night I hold back the darkness. The confessor, a learned man, tries to convince him that these visions are the product of exhaustion. But Louis produces document after document, intercepted letters, decoded messages, intelligence reports that paint a picture of a Europe-wide conspiracy against the French monarchy that stretches across generations. Look at these papers, Father, Louis says, spreading the documents across his study table. Here, a letter from a Bavarian count to his son, speaking of the great work that must be accomplished by our grandchildren. Here, a coded message from London, describing preparations for the century to come. Here, a Spanish dispatch referring to the inevitable fall of the French sun. They are not plotting against me, Father. They are plotting against the very idea of what I represent, and they are willing to wait 100 years to see their work completed. His sleeplessness has become legendary, but now it carries a different meaning. It is no longer the vigilance of a divine ruler, but the haunted wakefulness of a man who fears that to close his eyes would be to confront the growing darkness within himself. The palace that was meant to be his monument has become his mausoleum, and he its most magnificent and terrible exhibit. The transformation is complete, though few dare speak of it aloud. The Sun King has become a different kind of celestial body, not the life-giving star he once claimed to be, but something closer to a comet, brilliant and destructive, burning across the sky of history with a light that will be visible long after the fire consumed everything that fed it. But the most remarkable document in this hidden archive is Lewis's own handwritten testament, sealed and hidden behind the portrait of his father in his private study. In this letter, meant to be opened only by his successor, he lays out a detailed plan for preventing the catastrophe he has foreseen. It reads like the work of a madman, but every recommendation, from limiting the power of provincial parliaments to restricting foreign influence in court, would, if implemented, have prevented the exact sequence of events that led to the French Revolution. "My son," he writes, "you will think your father was mad. You will read these words and believe that sleeplessness drove me to paranoid delusions. But I beg you, study the patterns I have uncovered, follow the threads I have traced, trust the intelligence network I have built. The enemies of France are patient. They think in centuries, not years. They have already set in motion the forces that will destroy everything we have built, but only if you let sleep overcome vigilance, only if you trust where trust will be betrayed." The letter is dated 3 days before his death. By then, he had not slept more than 4 hours in any single night for over 30 years. His physician's records, kept secret until now, reveal the toll this vigil took on his body. Dr. Fagan's autopsy notes describe a brain showing signs of chronic sleep deprivation, so severe that it had begun to physically reshape itself. Yet, paradoxically, those same notes describe mental faculties that remained sharp until his final day, a memory that could recall conversations from decades past, and a strategic intelligence that his enemies admitted was unmatched in Europe. The question that haunts historians who have access to these documents is this: was Louis XIV a madman whose paranoid delusions accidentally stumbled upon real conspiracies, or was he a prophet whose supernatural vigilance actually held back the tide of history for an entire generation? And if the latter, what does that say about the nature of power, madness, and the price of seeing too clearly into the heart of human darkness? As we prepare to witness his final transformation, remember that the man you have been watching is both victim and visionary, both madman and oracle, both the most powerful king in history and the most tortured prisoner in his own golden cage. Now, as we prepare to step back from this golden world and return to our own time, let us take one final walk through the silent corridors of Versailles. The morning light streams through those same crystal windows, but it falls now on empty rooms where the echoes of absolute power still whisper in the corners. But this is not just any morning. This is September 1st, 1715, the last dawn that Louis XIV will ever see. After 72 years as king and 31 years without a full night's sleep, the Sun King is finally ready to close his eyes forever. The scene is unlike anything in royal history. Instead of the usual crowd of courtiers fighting for position around his bed, Louis has dismissed everyone except his great-grandson, the future Louis XV, a 5-year-old child who will inherit not just a throne, but the burden of a prophecy. "Come closer, child," the dying king whispers, his voice still carrying the authority that once commanded nations. "Your great-grandfather has something to tell you, something more important than any lesson in kingship you will ever receive." The child approaches the enormous bed where Louis lies, still magnificent even in his final weakness. The morning light streaming through the windows catches the gold thread in his nightgown, making him appear to glow one last time. "I have been awake for 30 years, Louis tells him, watching over France while others slept, guarding against dangers that most men could not see. Soon I will sleep, and you will become king. But you must promise me something. You must promise to remember what I am about to tell you." Think of Louis in his final years, still magnificent, still terrible, but carrying within his gilded frame the weight of a lesson that all who seek to touch divinity must eventually learn. The palace around him stands as a monument to human ambition, but also as a reminder that even the most brilliant light casts the deepest shadows. But what happens next defies every protocol of royal death. Instead of making the usual deathbed speech about duty and honor, Louis produces a key from beneath his pillow, a key that opens a secret compartment in his desk, revealing the documents he has spent decades collecting. These papers contain the proof of everything I have seen, he tells the child. Conspiracies that span generations, plans that will not bear fruit until you are grown, enemies who smile today but will strike tomorrow. Your tutors will tell you that your great-grandfather was mad, that lack of sleep drove him to see threats where none existed. But when the time comes, and you will know when it comes, remember these words. The price of the crown is eternal vigilance, and the price of vigilance is a sacrifice of all human comfort, even sleep itself. The most remarkable aspect of this deathbed scene, recorded by Father Letellier, who was hidden behind a tapestry, is what happens next. As Louis speaks these words, he suddenly sits up in bed with a strength that should have been impossible for a dying man. But here is the secret they must never know, he continues, his voice rising to fill the chamber. The madness was real. The sleeplessness was real. The paranoia was real. But it was all necessary, because the threats were real too. I have spent my life walking the razor's edge between sanity and revelation, and I pray to God that you will have the wisdom to know when that terrible vigil is required. The mirrors that reflected his image into infinity continue their patient vigil, holding within their silver depths the memory of a king who forgot that to be human is not a failure to be overcome, but a truth to be embraced. In seeking to become the sun itself, he discovered that stars, no matter how brilliant, must eventually exhaust the fuel that gives them life. At exactly noon, as the sun reaches its zenith above Versailles, Louis XIV closes his eyes for the last time. His final words, heard only by his great-grandson, are these: "The sun sets, but also rises. Remember that, child. When the darkness comes for France, remember that the sun always rises." The moment Louis dies, something extraordinary happens. Throughout the palace, clocks that have run perfectly for decades suddenly stop. Mirrors crack without cause. Fountains cease to flow. It's as if Versailles itself is acknowledging that its animating spirit has finally departed. But the most unsettling detail comes from the royal astronomer, who notes in his official log that at the exact moment of the king's death, the sun itself seemed to dim for exactly 3 minutes, an astronomical impossibility that nonetheless was observed and recorded by watchers across France. The child who would become Louis XV later wrote in his private memoirs, "I did not understand my great-grandfather's words for many years. But when the revolution came, when I saw the palaces burning and the monarchy falling exactly as he had predicted, I finally comprehended the terrible gift he had tried to give me, the knowledge that some truths can only be seen from the other side of madness, and that sometimes the price of saving a kingdom is the sacrifice of your own soul." As you drift back to your own time, carry with you the image of those endless halls where golden light dances with shadows, where the footsteps of a sleepless king still echo in the quiet hours before dawn. Let it remind you that power, like light itself, is most beautiful when it knows its own limits, most enduring when it accepts the gentle mercy of darkness and rest. But also remember this: sometimes a madman is the only one who sees clearly. Sometimes the paranoid is the only one who recognizes real danger. And sometimes the greatest act of love is to sacrifice your sanity so that others can sleep safely in their beds. The palace sleeps now, as its king never could, dreaming perhaps of a different story, one where the sun was content to be magnificent without claiming to be eternal, where the king remembered that even gods must sometimes close their eyes and trust the world to continue spinning without their constant watch. Yet in the deepest vaults of Versailles, those secret documents remain, waiting for the day when someone else will have the courage to read them, to follow the threads Louis XIV traced across centuries, to take up the burden of eternal vigilance that he carried alone for so long. The question that haunts Versailles to this day is simple. Are those documents still relevant? Do the patterns Louis uncovered still persist? And if so, who walks the midnight corridors now, carrying the terrible burden of being the only one awake in a world that prefers to sleep? In this peaceful darkness, all shadows are equal, all light is borrowed, and all dreams are possible. But some dreams, as Louis XIV learned too late, are prophecies in disguise, and some sleep is not rest but surrender to forces that never tire, never rest, and never forgive those who dare to call themselves kings. The sun has set on the Sun King, but the questions he raised will burn forever in the minds of those brave enough to ask them. What is the true price of absolute power? How much of your humanity must you sacrifice to protect those you love? And when madness and revelation walk hand in hand, how do you tell the difference between vision and delusion? These are the secrets that Versailles still keeps, the mysteries that no amount of gold can illuminate, the shadows that even the Sun King himself could never banish from the corners of his glittering prison. Sleep well if you can, but remember, somewhere in the world, someone is always awake, watching, waiting, carrying the burden that Louis XIV carried for 72 years. And perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all. But here's the question that will haunt you long after the story ends. The secret documents that Louis XIV left behind were never fully decoded. They remain in the archives of Versailles, written in a cipher that has resisted 3 centuries of attempts to crack it. Some say they contain the names of the families involved in the multi-generational conspiracy against the French monarchy. Others believe they hold the key to preventing similar threats in our own time. What we do know is this. Every 50 years, someone receives permission to attempt a new decoding of Louis XIV's Final Testament. The last attempt was in 1965. The next is scheduled for 2015. When that day comes, when those final secrets are finally revealed, will we discover that the Sun King was a madman whose paranoid delusions created phantom threats? Or will we learn that he was the only one who saw clearly that his terrible vigil held back forces that are still moving in the shadows today? Until then, we can only wonder. Who among us has the courage to carry such knowledge? Who among us would sacrifice sleep, sanity, and peace of mind to protect others from threats they cannot see? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if Louis XIV was right, if the conspiracy he uncovered really does span centuries, who is watching now while the rest of us sleep?